I have also learned something that troubles me deeply.
What Buckingham Palace just announced about Prince William has left the entire world in absolute shock. For months they've been hiding something. The carefully staged smiles, the public appearances, all of it was a cover for what was really happening behind closed doors.
At a pivotal moment in human history, a moment that demands courage, cooperation and unwavering commitment.
Now the truth is finally out, and it's far worse than anyone imagined. Royal insiders are calling it unprecedented. The palace tried to keep this secret, but they couldn't anymore. What they just revealed about William will make your jaw drop. You need to hear this before they take it down. It all began on a cold morning at Windsor Castle. The sky was grey and overcast, with thick mist rolling across the gardens and settling around the ancient stone walls. Inside the castle, an eerie stillness had taken hold. The usual sounds of daily life, the footsteps of staff members, the distant chatter, the ringing of bells, had all but disappeared. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that nobody wanted to acknowledge. Outside the gates, journalists had gathered in small groups. They stood huddled against the cold, their cameras ready, their notebooks open, but their usual energy was absent. There was something different in the air that morning, a tension that even the most experienced reporters could feel. They weren't just waiting for a story, they were waiting for confirmation of something they hoped wasn't true. At 7 in the morning, a black car appeared at the end of the long driveway. It moved slowly toward the gates, tires crunching over the gravel path. When it stopped, Princess Catherine stepped out. She was dressed simply but elegantly, her long coat buttoned against the morning chill. But there was no smile, no wave to the cameras, none of the warmth that the public had come to expect from her. Her face looked pale and drawn, her eyes distant and unfocused. For a brief moment, she paused by the car door, her hand gripping the handle as though steadying herself. Then she climbed inside and the car pulled away, disappearing into the fog. One reporter standing near the gate turned to his colleague and whispered the question that was on everyone's mind. Where is William? Nobody had an answer. Inside Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was just as tense. Staff members moved through the hallways with unusual care, their voices hushed, their expressions worried. In the private wing of the residence, the royal nanny stood by a window with Prince George and Princess Charlotte. Both children were still in their pajamas, staring out at the fog-covered gardens. Charlotte spoke quietly, her voice small and uncertain. "Mummy said we're not going to school today." The nanny nodded gently. "That's right, sweetheart. You'll stay home today." George frowned, clearly confused. But why? The nanny hesitated before answering. "Just for family reasons, my dear. Nothing to worry about." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Something was very wrong, and the entire household could feel it. Prince William had not been seen publicly for several days. His last appearance had been at a charity event in London the previous week. Those who attended remembered it clearly. William had looked tired and unwell. Halfway through his speech, he had paused, pressed his hand to his forehead, and quietly excused himself from the stage. The palace had later issued a brief statement saying he was feeling unwell, but that explanation had done little to ease the growing concern among the public and the press. Now the silence from the palace was louder than any official statement could have been. Every hour that passed without news only deepened the worry. Later that morning, Catherine was seen entering a different part of the castle. She walked with purpose but without her usual confidence. Her heels echoed sharply against the marble floors as she made her way to the king's study. She paused outside the heavy wooden door, took a deep breath, and knocked softly. A low voice from inside answered, "Come in." King Charles was sitting by the window, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The morning light caught his silver hair, making him look older than he had just weeks before. He looked up as Catherine entered, and without a word, he simply nodded. His face was grave, his expression distant. "Thank you for handling this," he said quietly, his voice rough with exhaustion. Catherine sat down across from him. "The children are at home," she said. "They're asking questions." The king closed his eyes for a moment. "They're too young to understand," he replied. There was a long pause. Outside, a bird called out briefly before falling silent again. Catherine's fingers twisted nervously in her lap. "Do we tell them?" she asked. Charles hesitated. "Not yet." The room fell into a heavy silence. Even the ticking of the clock seemed to fade into the background. Downstairs, the palace communications team had gathered in a small office. Papers were spread across the table, phones buzzing quietly. The tension in the room was almost suffocating. They had been instructed to prepare a statement, but it was to be brief and vague. No details, no explanations. Just enough to acknowledge the situation without revealing too much. One of the younger aides looked up from his laptop and said softly, "This will change everything." At exactly 4 o'clock that afternoon, a royal spokesperson stepped outside the castle gates. The gathered press fell silent immediately. The spokesperson's voice was calm but strained as he read from a prepared statement. "The royal family requests privacy as they deal with a personal matter involving the Prince of Wales." That was all. Just one sentence. But those few words carried an enormous weight. The crowd of reporters stood frozen, unsure how to react. The rain that had been threatening all day finally began to fall, washing across the courtyard in heavy sheets. Cameras flashed, umbrellas opened, but nobody moved. The silence was deafening. Inside the castle, Catherine stood alone by a window in a dimly lit corridor. From her vantage point, she could see the reporters beginning to scatter, their umbrellas bobbing as they disappeared into the mist. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, pale and tired. She pressed her hand against the cold window and whispered softly, "Just come back to us, William." The words hung in the air, unheard by anyone but herself. As evening fell, the castle lights glowed faintly against the fog, turning the stone walls into ghostly shadows. Servants moved quietly through the halls, closing curtains and locking doors. The sense of dread that had settled over Windsor that morning had not lifted. If anything, it had grown heavier. Something had happened to Prince William, something serious enough to bring the entire royal household to a standstill. And as the night closed in around the castle, one thing became painfully clear. The future king was facing a crisis that no title, no privilege, and no amount of tradition could protect him from. A cold wind swept through the grounds of Sandringham estate, bending the tall trees that lined the gravel driveway. The grand house stood silent against the darkening sky, its windows glowing dimly from within. Inside, the royal family had gathered, but this was no celebration or formal occasion. They had come together because of something none of them wanted to face, something that had shaken the very foundation of their family. The atmosphere inside was thick with tension. Every clock seemed to tick louder than usual. Every creak of the floorboards echoed through the halls. Servants moved quietly, careful not to disturb the heavy silence that had settled over the estate. It felt as though even the walls were listening, waiting for news that nobody wanted to hear. King Charles sat alone in the drawing room, staring into the fireplace. The flames danced and flickered, casting shadows across at his tired face. His hands were clasped tightly together, his shoulders slumped forward. The weight of the crown had never felt heavier than it did in this moment. Across from him sat Queen Camilla, unusually quiet. She stirred her tea without drinking it, her gaze lost somewhere in the depths of the fire. "Has there been any word from Catherine?" she asked softly. Charles shook his head slowly. "Not yet," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "She's with him." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and final. The door to the drawing room opened quietly and a private secretary stepped inside. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "Prince Harry has arrived." Charles looked up, his expression unreadable. "Show him in," he said. Moments later, Harry entered the room. His coat was still damp from the rain outside, his face pale from the long journey. There were no photographers waiting for him this time, no flashing cameras, no public smiles. This was simply a son returning home to a family, in crisis. He stood in the doorway for a moment, uncertain, before speaking. "I came as soon as I heard," he said quietly. Charles rose slowly from his chair. For a long moment, father and son stood facing each other, both carrying the weight of years of complicated history, of words left unsaid and wounds not fully healed. Then Charles stepped forward and placed a trembling hand on Harry's shoulder. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice breaking slightly. Camilla rose quietly and left the room, understanding that they needed privacy. The fire crackled softly between them as they both sat down. "What happened?" Harry asked finally, unable to hold back the question any longer. Charles exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. "William's been unwell for weeks," he began. "He pushed himself too far. Catherine tried to stop him, but he wouldn't listen." Harry looked down, his jaw tightening. "And now?" he asked. Charles's voice dropped even lower. "He's under medical observation, that's all the doctors will say." The room fell silent again, filled only by the soft hiss of the fire. Outside, rain continued to fall steadily, washing over the estate like a curtain of grief. The staff spoke in hushed tones throughout the house, knowing that the press would soon pick up on the story. Rumours were already beginning to circulate. Catherine had been making the journey from Windsor to a private clinic near London every single morning. Photographers had caught glimpses of her arriving and leaving, her eyes red from tears, her usual composure barely holding together. She had become the image of quiet suffering, graceful on the surface, but clearly devastated underneath. In the privacy of William's hospital room, she sat beside him for hours each day. Her hand rested over his, never letting go. Machines hummed softly around them, their rhythmic beeping the only sound breaking through the silence. One evening, as the sun set outside the window, she spoke to him in a trembling voice. "You promised me," she whispered. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything she was holding inside. Back at Sandringham, the tension continued to build. The royal family remained out of sight, curtains drawn, phones left unanswered. Camilla visited the small chapel on the estate every morning, lighting a single candle in silence. She would sit there alone for several minutes, her head bowed, before returning to the main house. Charles spent hours standing by the window, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens where William used to play as a young boy. "How quickly it all slips away," he whispered to himself one afternoon. Harry joined his father by the window later that day. The two of them stood in silence for a while before Harry spoke. "I remember when he used to race me across those lawns," he said with a sad smile. "He never let me win." Charles nodded slowly. "He never let anyone win," he replied quietly. "Not even life." As night fell over Sandringham, the estate glowed faintly under the sunsets. Moonlight. Outside the gates, the press had already begun building their stories. Rumours swirled about collapse, secret diagnoses, and royal crisis. Reporters spoke in hushed, serious tones, their faces grave as they updated their audiences. Inside, the family's world had shrunk to nothing but whispers and waiting. The palace had released only the briefest of statements. The family asks for understanding and privacy. Those few words sent shockwaves through the nation. Every headline now carried William's name. Every news broadcast opened with updates about his condition, though nobody seemed to know anything concrete. Speculation ran wild, but the truth remained locked behind the palace walls. Camilla sat with Charles again that evening, her voice gentle but firm. "You should rest," she urged. Charles shook his head. "I cannot," he said. "Every time I close my eyes, I see him as a boy, running down those halls, laughing. I keep hearing his voice." Camilla reached across and placed her hand over his. "He's strong, Charles," she said softly. "He'll come back to us." But even as she said the words, she could see the doubt in his eyes, the fear of a father who had already lost so much. "I don't know if I can lose another piece of this family," Charles murmured, his voice barely audible. The pain in his words was unmistakable. He was thinking of Diana, of the years of estrangement with Harry, of all the losses and regrets that had marked his life. The thought of losing William was almost too much to bear. At midnight, a car arrived quietly at the gates of Sandringham. Catherine stepped out, her movements slow and exhausted. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her steps heavy as she was escorted inside. The sound of her heels echoed through the empty halls as she made her way to the drawing room. Charles rose immediately when she entered. "How is he?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. Catherine's lips trembled. "He's fighting," she said softly. "He's tired, but he's fighting." Harry closed his eyes in silent relief. Camilla stood and crossed the room, taking Catherine's hand in hers. No one spoke after that. There were no formal words, no royal protocols, just four people sitting together in the flickering firelight, bound by love and fear. The night stretched on, long and uncertain as the family kept their vigil. Outside, the rain continued to fall, steady and relentless, as if the sky itself was mourning alongside them. The sky over London was heavy and colourless, the kind of grey that seems to drain the life out of everything beneath it. Outside Kensington Palace, cameras lined the gates in neat rows, rain dripping softly off umbrellas as reporters whispered among themselves. It had been weeks since the nation had last seen Prince William in public, and though the palace had tried to maintain its silence, the cracks were beginning to show. The pressure for answers was mounting, and everyone could feel it. That morning, the tension finally broke. A car pulled up to the front entrance of the palace, and Princess Catherine stepped out. She looked composed at first glance, her posture straight, her clothing immaculate. But anyone looking closely could see the truth written across her face. Her eyes were red and swollen from sleepless nights, her skin pale, her movements slow and deliberate, as though even the simple act of walking required tremendous effort. She had faced crowds countless times before, had stood beside William at hundreds of public events, but this time was entirely different. This time, the world wasn't watching their future queen. They were watching a woman barely holding herself together. The press waited in anxious silence, cameras pointed, hearts pounding in anticipation. When Catherine reached the podium that had been set up outside the palace, her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the flashing lights and the sea of faces. Then, she spoke, her voice soft but steady, her accent clear despite the strain. "I want to thank everyone for your love and kindness," she began. "It has meant more to us than I can ever express." She paused, swallowing hard, her breath catching in her throat. "These last few weeks have been very difficult for our family, but your prayers, your letters, your thoughts, they've kept us strong." Her voice cracked on those final words. A single tear escaped down her cheek. She made no attempt to hide it, no effort to maintain the perfect royal composure. The cameras zoomed closer, capturing every detail of her pain, but she did not look away. "William is receiving the best care possible," she continued, her words coming slower now, each one seeming to cost her something. "He is fighting." She paused again and then managed the faintest, most fragile smile. "Please keep him in your hearts," she whispered. "He needs it." With that, she turned away from the cameras, her composure finally slipping as she walked, back toward the waiting car. The door closed behind her with a soft click, shutting out the noise, the lights, the endless questions that hung in the air. Inside the car, Catherine pressed her forehead against the cold glass window. The tears came quietly this time, silent and constant, streaming down her face. She didn't bother to wipe them away. There was no one to see them now, no one to judge. No cameras to capture this private moment of complete exhaustion. When she arrived at the hospital, the corridors greeted her with sterile light and the faint hum of medical equipment. She had made this journey every day, sometimes twice a day, for weeks now. She would sit beside William's bed for hours, holding his hand, whispering things only he could hear, things she hoped somehow reached him wherever he was. His face was pale but peaceful, and the steady rise and fall of his chest was the only sound she truly listened for. "Do you remember the garden at Anmer?" she said softly one afternoon, her fingers brushing gently over his hand. "The one where the children chased butterflies last summer. You promised we'd take them there again this year." Her words trembled in the quiet air of the room. The space smelled faintly of disinfectant mixed with the flowers someone had left by the window. She stared at his still face and blinked back the fresh tears that burned behind her eyes. Every memory came flooding back like a tide she couldn't control. His laughter echoing through the halls of their home, the way he would lift George onto his shoulders and carry him through the gardens. His quiet strength when the world seemed too heavy, when the pressure of duty and expectation threatened to crush them both. She remembered his hand over hers at their wedding, the warmth of it, the certainty. Now that hand lay cold and still in hers, and she could do nothing but wait. At home, the children asked questions she had no good answers for. George wanted to know when Daddy would be coming back. Charlotte asked if he was just sleeping for a very long time. Louis, too young to fully understand what was happening, kept wandering around the house asking where Daddy had gone. Catherine would smile as best she could, brush their hair gently, and say softly, "He's getting better, darling." But the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. Prince Harry arrived at the hospital that evening. He and William hadn't been seen together in public for months, and the distance between them had been well documented by the press. But tonight, all of that fell away. When Harry entered the room and saw his brother lying motionless beneath the white hospital sheets, he froze. Catherine rose from her chair and nodded at him quietly. "He'll be glad you're here," she whispered. Then she stepped out of the room, leaving the two brothers alone. Harry pulled a chair close to the bedside and sat down heavily. For a long time he said nothing. He simply watched, listening to the rhythmic sound of William's breathing, the soft beeping of the monitors. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Hey mate, it's been a while." He looked down at his hands, clasped tightly together in his lap. "You've always been the strong one," he continued softly. "I should have said it before. You held everything together. The family, the legacy, the name, even when it wasn't fair to you." His voice broke slightly. "Just don't leave us now. We're not ready for that." The words hung in the quiet room, raw and vulnerable. He reached out and touched his brother's hand, and for just a fleeting second, he thought he felt the faintest squeeze in return. When Catherine returned a short while later, she found Harry still sitting there, tears shining in his eyes. He looked up at her and said simply, "He's fighting." She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her own cheeks. That night, the palace released an official statement. Television screens around the world lit up as news anchors read the words slowly and carefully, their voices heavy with sympathy. Prince William is receiving ongoing treatment for a serious health condition. The family is by his side. The words spread like wildfire. Headlines changed instantly across every major news outlet. In cities and small towns alike, people stopped what they were doing to listen, to whisper prayers, to hold each other a little tighter. Outside the hospital, candles began to appear. One at a time at first, then dozens, then hundreds. The hospital gates shimmered in the flickering light as strangers gathered together, holding hands, standing in silence. Inside, Catherine stood by the window of William's room, looking down at the crowd below. The sight of all those people, all those strangers who loved him without truly knowing him, made her heart ache in a way she couldn't fully describe. She turned back toward the bed, wiping her tears away. "Look at them, William," she whispered. "They're all waiting for you. So am I." It was midnight, and the hospital halls were almost completely silent. Only the soft hum of machines and the distant rhythm of rain tapping against the windows broke through the stillness. The world outside had finally gone to sleep. But inside that small room, the one everyone had been praying for, time seemed to have stopped entirely. Catherine sat beside William's bed, her eyes red and swollen from weeks of sleepless nights. The glow of the medical monitors painted her face in pale, flickering light. Every soft beep was a fragile promise that he was still here, still fighting, still holding on. She hadn't left the hospital in days. The nurses had tried gently to persuade her to go home and rest, to take care of herself, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Her hand never left his, her fingers intertwined with his, as though her touch alone could anchor him to this world. Sometimes she spoke to him, her voice trembling, her words spilling into the quiet like prayers whispered in an empty church. "George asked about you. Again today," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair gently from his forehead. "He wanted to know when Daddy's coming home. I told him soon. I told him you keep your promise." Her voice broke, but she continued anyway. "Charlotte's been drawing pictures for you. She said she's making one for every day you're away, so you won't miss a thing when you come back." She paused, wiping away a tear that had slipped down her cheek. "And Louis," she said with the faintest hint of a smile, "Louis said he's saving all his hugs for you. He asked me if Daddy knows how many hugs he has waiting." She looked at William's still face, her fingers tracing the familiar lines of his hand. "They need you," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "We all do. I don't know how to do this without you." The rain outside grew heavier, washing against the windows like a quiet storm that matched the turmoil in her heart. Inside the room, Catherine sat in that half-light, surrounded by the soft beeping of machines that marked the fragile rhythm of life itself. Across London, at Buckingham Palace, King Charles sat alone in his private study. The room was dark except for a single lamp that cast long shadows across the walls. His shoulders sagged under the weight of everything he was carrying. Before him on the desk lay an old photograph, one he had kept close for years. It showed Diana smiling brightly, young William at her side, both of them caught in a moment of pure happiness. He stared at the photograph for a long time, his hands trembling slightly as he picked it up. The memories came in waves, washing over him with unexpected force. Her laughter, her warmth, the way she had always protected their boys from the cold, harsh world that existed beyond the palace gates. "Watch over him, Diana," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "Please, watch over our boy." His eyes glistened in the dim light. He closed them tightly and took a deep, shaking breath, as though reaching for strength from a place he hadn't visited in years. "He's just like you," he murmured to the photograph. "Brave, kind, and far too gentle for this world." A single tear rolled down his cheek and he made no effort to wipe it away. Across the city and across the entire country, London glowed under the rain. Television screens stayed on through the night in homes throughout Britain. The same images repeated on every channel. Catherine by William's bedside. Candles flickering outside the hospital gates. The palace's silent, imposing facade. People around the world couldn't sleep. In small apartments and grand houses alike, candles burned in windows. The soft light flickered like a collective heartbeat of hope, a silent vigil for a prince who had touched so many lives. The hours stretched on endlessly. Midnight turned to 1, 1 turned to 2. Still, Catherine sat unmoving beside the bed, whispering softly, her eyes fixed on William's face, as though willing him to open his eyes through sheer force of love. Then, something changed. At first, it was almost nothing, barely perceptible. A small movement, just the slightest twitch of his fingers. Catherine froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her hand tightened around his. She looked at him closely, afraid she had imagined it, afraid to hope. But then it happened again. His fingers moved, slow and uncertain, but undeniably real. Her heart leapt. "William," she breathed, her voice shaking. She leaned closer, tears already beginning to well in her eyes. "William, can you hear me?" The monitors continued their steady beeping. The rain still whispered against the windows. And then, as if pulling himself from the deepest sleep imaginable, his eyelids began to flutter. A second later, they opened. His eyes, tired and dazed, but beautifully, miraculously alive, met hers. For a moment, Catherine couldn't speak. The entire world seemed to fall away until it was just the two of them in that small room. He tried to say something, but no sound came out at first. His lips trembled, and then the faintest smile appeared on his face. Catherine gasped, a sound caught somewhere between laughter and sobbing. She covered her mouth with her free hand, then leaned forward, clutching his hand to her chest. "Thank you," she whispered through her tears. "Oh, thank you, thank you, thank you." The words tumbled out over and over. Within moments, doctors and nurses rushed into the room. The consultant was called immediately. Machines were checked, numbers were recorded, adjustments were made. But Catherine barely heard any of it. Her entire world had already changed in that single heartbeat when his eyes had opened and found hers. Minutes turned into hours, but these were different hours now. These were hours filled with breath, with hope, with the impossible miracle of his return. Word spread quickly through the palace. King Charles was still in a waiting room down the corridor when the doctor appeared in the doorway, smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. "Your Majesty," the doctor said softly, "he's awake." Charles froze. For a second he couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then slowly he rose from his chair, his legs unsteady beneath him. He made his way down the corridor, his heart pounding harder than it had in years. When he reached the doorway of William's room, he saw Catherine still holding their son's hand, her head bowed as though in silent prayer. Charles stepped closer, his voice barely more than a whisper. "My dear boy." William turned his head slightly, and though his voice was faint and rough from disuse, it was clear enough. "Father." It was just one word, but to Charles it was everything. It was forgiveness and love. and the continuation of a bond that had survived so much. He reached for William's hand, placing his own gently over Catherine's. No words followed. None were needed. The three of them sat there together in silence, and the air in that small hospital room felt different now, lighter somehow, filled with the quiet hum of miracles. Outside, the rain began to ease. The heavy clouds broke apart, revealing the faintest hint of dawn creeping across the horizon. Within hours, the news broke around the world. The palace released a short statement, only a few lines, but they were enough to make millions cry tears of relief and joy. His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales is awake and recovering. The family wishes to thank everyone for their prayers and support during this difficult time. Across Britain, the night that had begun in sorrow ended in pure joy. Church bells rang at sunrise in villages and cities alike. People embraced in the streets, strangers hugging one another with tears streaming down their faces. The candles that had burned outside the hospital as symbols of grief now became symbols of gratitude. Inside the hospital, Catherine finally allowed herself to rest. She laid her head gently beside William's arm on the bed, still holding his hand. He stirred faintly and whispered, "You didn't leave." "Never," she murmured, smiling through her tears. "I never will." As dawn broke over London, the first rays of sunlight touched the window of that quiet hospital room, bathing everything in warm, golden light. It felt like a new beginning, like the world itself was exhaling after holding its breath for far too long. In the days that followed, William's recovery continued slowly but steadily. The first morning he was well enough to leave the hospital, Catherine walked beside him through the gardens at Windsor. The early light spilled softly across the dew-covered grass, and the air felt different, cleaner somehow, as though the whole world had been washed clean. The birds sang as if they knew something wonderful had happened. William walked slowly down the narrow garden path, his steps still careful and measured, but there was a glow in his face that hadn't been there in months. A quiet peace, the kind that only comes after surviving something terrible. The garden had always been his refuge long before the weight of royal duties, before titles and expectations. It had been his mother's favourite place, and she had brought him here often as a child, teaching him the names of flowers, showing him where to listen for birdsong. Now, years later, walking through the same garden felt like walking through memory itself. Catherine smiled softly as they passed the roses. "They're all blooming again," she said. William nodded. "Everything feels new," he murmured, as if the world decided to start over. He stopped near a stone bench to rest. The early morning mist curled around them like something gentle and protective. "There was a time," he said quietly, "when I wasn't sure I'd see another morning like this." Catherine turned to him, her expression full of warmth and strength. "You're here now," she said, her hand resting on his. "That's what matters." He looked at her truly, and something in his eyes softened. "I wouldn't be if it weren't for you," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "You never left my side. You, Father, Harry, you all carried me when I couldn't stand." A gentle breeze moved through the garden, lifting the edge of his coat, carrying the sweet scent of flowers. William breathed deeply, filling his lungs with something more than just air. Hope. "I want to live differently now," he said, his voice steady and certain. Not chasing the rush anymore, not trying to be perfect. Just a present, just real.